This is how to wire an oil pressure gauge, the electric center base kind. And here is the finished wiring diagram right up front. A gauge on the dash, a sending unit screwed into the engine block, and 4 wires tying them together. By the end, you will know every terminal and exactly where each wire goes. Let's rewind and build it from scratch. First, there are 2 kinds of oil pressure gauge, and they wire completely differently. A mechanical gauge runs a thin tube of actual engine oil all the way up to the gauge. No electrics at all. This video is about the electric gauge, and the electric gauge is the one that needs a sender. That is the key difference from a voltage gauge. A voltage gauge reads voltage directly, straight off the system, with no sender in between. An oil pressure gauge cannot do that. Pressure is not electrical, so it relies on a sending unit down in the engine to turn oil pressure into a signal the gauge can read. No sender, no reading. Remember that one word, sender, and the whole diagram makes sense. So the electric gauge has 4 terminals on the back. 1. Ignition, a switch positive 12 volts, so the gauge only powers up with the key on. 2. Ground, the negative bolted to bare chassis metal. 3. Sender, usually marked S. This is the signal wire that runs to the sending unit on the engine. And 4. Illumination, the backlight that ties into your dash lights. Power, ground, sender, backlight. That sender terminal is the one thing that makes an oil gauge different from a simple voltmeter. Quick note, every diagram here is drawn in a free editor that runs right in your browser, circuitdiagrammaker.app. No install, no sign up. Open it in another tab and follow along. The link is below. Now, the heart of it, the sending unit or sender. Open one up in your head, and it is really just a variable resistor. As oil pressure pushes on a small diaphragm inside, a wiper moves and changes the sender's resistance. Low pressure, one resistance. High pressure, another. The gauge does nothing more than measure that resistance and swing the needle to match. Here is the part people miss. The sender completes its circuit through its own metal body, into the engine block, and back to ground through the block. So the gauge sends a signal down the S wire through the sender into the block, and the block has to be solidly grounded to the chassis for any of it to read right. A 1-wire sender grounds entirely through its threads, which brings us to how it screws in. The sender screws into an oil galley, a threaded port on the engine that sees live oil pressure, often up near the oil filter or on the block. And there's a trap right in the threads. Because a 1-wire sender grounds through those very threads, you cannot just wrap them in Teflon-tape and seal it up. Plastic tape insulates the sender from the block and kills its ground path, and the gauge reads wrong or reads nothing. If you need to seal a weep, use a conductive sealant made for senders or leave enough bare thread for solid metal-to-metal contact. 2-wire senders dodge this entirely. They carry their own dedicated ground wire back to the gauge, so the thread ground does not matter. So check which sender you have. 1 wire. The block is your ground. Keep those threads conductive. 2 wires. Run that second wire back to the gauge's ground side. So how do you read a fault? 2 classic symptoms. If the needle pegs all the way high the second you turn the key, higher than any real oil pressure, the center signal wire is usually the problem, shorted to ground, or on some gauges, open. Unplug the sender for a moment. If the needle drops, the sender or its ground is your culprit, not the gauge. And if the gauge reads 0 and never moves, check the input side first. No switch power at the ignition terminal, a bad gauge ground, or a dead sender that has stopped changing resistance. Do not condemn the gauge until you have confirmed 12 volts with the key on, a clean ground, and a sender that actually reacts. Let's lay one out in the free editor. I start on a blank canvas and drop in parts from the free do-it-yourself pack. A source for the switch feed, a switch for the ignition, the gauge itself, and a ground. Then I press W and draw the wires, and they snap in with clean square corners. Move any part, and the wires follow it. This is exactly the kind of sketch you would hand to whoever is doing the install, clear, labeled, and easy to change. When the drawing is done, one click opens the export menu. PNG is free, good enough to drop into a work order or a group chat with whoever is under the car. Vector formats like PDF and SVG sit on the paid plans. Full disclosure, said plainly, this tool is ours, and it is genuinely good for clean wiring sketches you can share and mark up. So that is how to wire an electric oil pressure gauge. Switch ignition power, a clean ground, the sender wire out to the sending unit, and a backlight off your dash lights. The sender is just a variable resistor in the engine block. So keep that block ground solid and keep the threads conductive on a one-wire sender. Open the free editor, drop in a gauge and a sender, and wire your own. The link is below. Subscribe for a new diagram explained every week, and I will see you in the next one.